So yeah, my name's Amy, and I work here in Oxford in the field of Christian apologetics, which really means kind of, I guess, theology and philosophy, but looking at the big questions that people have in life, that also then relate to faith and the existence of God. And so today we're going to be exploring this subject, where is God in all the suffering? And as was just said, my book on this subject has just been released. So obviously there's a massive amount we could say about this, and there's so many aspects of it to explore. So we're going to spend some time together, and I'll open up a few ideas and then throw it open to questions, and would really value your questions and your participation. So where is God in all the suffering? I think I'd want to start by saying that the truth is that times are really hard for all of us at the moment, and that our experience of suffering in this world is going to vary, but there isn't a single one of us who isn't marked in some way by this personally. So this question is an intellectual question. It's a question about the existence of God and whether God could actually exist and be good and loving, and this be the world that is. And it's also a personal question for people of faith, or perhaps people exploring faith. Does God really love me? Does a loving God actually exist for me, since I'm going through all of this suffering world? So whatever your beliefs about the world, why we're here, whether there's any purpose to our existence, why there's so much pain, whether God exists, what that God might be like or not be like, at some point in our lives, most of us are going to find ourselves asking this why question in an experience of pain. And that instinct to ask why is actually really deeply human. When I was 29, I gave birth to twin boys, and although that could be an illustration of pain and suffering in the world, actually I want to sort of draw out an experience of what it was like when they were toddlers. So they were starting to speak and kind of formulate their thoughts into words. And I remember a phase they went through when they both constantly asked why, and it was like having why in stereo throughout the day. Every single thing that was asked of them or that they observed in the world was sort of precursored by this word why. On one morning between when they woke up and lunchtime, I counted 98 occurrences of the why question in our home, and I made a note of it in my diary in an effort to hold on to my sanity. It's a deep thing about us as human beings, that we're wired to ask why. And so as we reflect together on this question of suffering and where God might be and why suffering happens, why it hurts so much, we're going to be thinking about different kind of potential starting points for addressing this why question, because not every framework, not every worldview, not every system of thought or religion begins in the same place in addressing this question. And it isn't only Christianity that needs to answer this question about suffering and why the world is as it is. So I want to sort of briefly explore a few alternatives and then look at what Christianity has to say. So you may be aware that Eastern philosophy views human suffering through the sort of dual lenses of something called karma and something called reincarnation. So when something painful happens, when people suffer in the world, if we approach the world from this perspective, we look at that incident of a person or a large number of people suffering, we look at it through that lens. Karma tells you that there's a moral law of cause and effect that guides all the circumstances of everyone's lives. So if I get a disease or I go through an accident, the law of karma tells me that I'm getting what I deserve. If I observe someone else suffering in some way, and I look at them through the lens of karma, the conclusion is that the person suffering deserves it. And the thing that I've done wrong, or that person has done wrong, that has brought about this suffering, it may not be immediately obvious to me, because this happens through this cycle of reincarnation. So it actually may be something that someone's done in a previous life. The universe recycles us over multiple lifetimes, it's believed. And so we might be experiencing karma for something done in a previous life. Now, for some of us, it might be sort of quite hard to really believe that people actually look at the world this way. But I'm here in Oxford this morning, and years and years ago, we had a neighbour in Oxford who believed that her husband worked for the university. She was a very well educated person, but she believed that she'd been a member of the French resistance in a previous life, and she felt that her failure to pass on a particular message during the war was the cause of her back pain in this life. You see, she believed that karma was running its course. So if you look at the world through that lens, suffering is inflicted on us by a faceless system of law, leaving us getting what we deserve, and leaving us, when we're in pain, floundering and concluding that it's our fault. So there's a second possibility, and that's kind of Eastern thought. A second possibility is a more fatalistic way of looking at the world. And one of the great monotheistic faiths of the world, Islam, looks at suffering through this perspective. So within Islam, the teaching is that there's a transcendent God who is absolutely and directly in control of every aspect and every detail of this universe. It's absolute fatalism. So as a consequence, human beings don't have real choice. There's actually only one will in the universe, and it is God's will. And that's why that word, inshallah, God willing, is so significant for Muslims. To give you an illustration of this, a number of years ago, a friend of mine was involved in training Iraqi soldiers for service in their own armed forces. And one of the exercises that he'd been required to take these people through was a sort of survival exercise, and they used a disused swimming pool in Iraq and filled it with water. And this British officer was required to explain to every person what was going to happen, and that they were fully clothed and they were all carrying their packs, and they were going to be pushed into the deep end of the pool, and the goal was to swim to the surface and tread water for a certain amount of time and then climb out. So the first two kind of recruits were selected. The whole exercise was explained to them. They're fully clothed, they've got their packs on, and they're pushed into the deep end of this pool. One of them struggles to the surface, does the water treading and sort of clambers out of the pool, but the other one sinks like a stone to the bottom. And the instructors are watching and worried, and they quickly realise there's a problem. So one of them dives in, gets hold of the man, drags him to the surface. They need to pump his chest. The man coughs up all this water, gasping for air, as the instructors are shouting, "Why didn't you swim?" And the guy just shrugs and he replies, "Well, inshallah, if it be God's will that I live, I would live. And if it be his will that I die, I would die. Clearly it's God's will that I live because you saved me." And that was an insight into a sort of mindset of God's will being the only will in the universe and all that matters. And since good and evil and suffering and pain are a part of our experience of life, they must both be God's will. So God is directly responsible for the suffering and pain that people exist. And so actually asking why doesn't really make sense. And then there's a third sort of perspective, a different point of view offered by what we might call naturalism. Naturalism is the system of thought derived from the belief that everything in life has a purely natural or physical material explanation. So there's no God, there's no supernatural realm. So the answer to the question, where is God in all the suffering, for naturalism would be nowhere, because God doesn't exist. Naturalism tells us there's no spiritual or religious dimension to life. There's no God who created the natural world. Human beings are our own highest moral authority. We just determine our own destiny and our own morality. And so within this sort of way of looking at the world through this lens, any experience of pain or suffering is essentially random. It's a consequence of living in a physical world and nothing more. And because the physical biochemical world is all that exists, any sense of connection that I may experience to another person is viewed primarily in physiological terms. So, for example, the pain I might experience as the result of losing someone I'm connected to doesn't have a deeper metaphysical or spiritual dimension. Their loss is understood physically, materially, and naturally. It's the loss of the stuff of their body and my physical experience of their existence. So when it comes to pain and suffering that has a more obvious, directly moral dimension, this way of looking at the world is particularly significant. So, for example, if a woman is sexually assaulted, naturalism doesn't root morality objectively in God. So sexual assault is wrong in absolute terms in any culture, whatever our preferences, because there's a source of morality above us. God is the judge of it. Instead, it's rooted, morality is rooted either subjectively in personal experience. I personally don't have a moral framework that includes sexual assault, and so I don't want this to happen to me or to anyone else that I care about, therefore it's wrong. Or it's rooted more subjectively in societal taboo. As a society, we've seen that sexual assault over our evolution is damaging, and so we need to create laws that make sure it doesn't happen. Richard Dawkins on a radio broadcast said, we supply our own basis for ethics as human beings. So morality, our ethics are rooted in us. So as we look at the world through that lens, we're not looking to a God, or we're not looking to a sort of source of morality beyond us who we can cry out to for justice. And our sense that wrongs which cause suffering are actually outrageous is just a sort of, I guess, a physical experience within the natural world. It's not pointing to a reality beyond our own experience of outrage. So as we look at naturalism, I think we need to ask the question: where is human life and the value of human life rooted? Is it the case that there is no God who gives human life value and meaning and significance beyond physical existence? And if that is the case, a big question for me is, why do we as human beings care so deeply about massacres, hunger, injustice, and the sufferings of other human beings that we may not have a direct connection with, or a sort of evolutionary predisposition to care about their survival? And why, if the world is purely physical and material and there's no metaphysical reality to us, why does suffering really matter, and why does it hurt so much? Where do we get this sense of the value of a human life from? Because our outrage in reaction to suffering, if we take, for example, something like the suffering of the Yazidi women, who most of us won't have a personal connection to, yet we know that what happened to them is wrong, and many of us will be moved at a deep level to care and to be outraged about what happened to them. And then we add that to our own human experience of pain and loss. When we go through it, we sense that something more is happening than the death of the body of the person that we love. do those experiences actually point towards something beyond just the material world, and point us to ask this question: where is God in all the suffering? So amidst these alternative starting places for considering suffering, whether it's karma or Islam or naturalism, there is another alternative, and it's this perspective I want us to spend a little bit of time on now, the Judeo and specifically Christian perspective, that is a point of view that sets forth the premises that God really does exist, and that God is a personal being who is essentially loving, and that God has made human beings in his image and given human beings a capacity to reason, to choose, and to love. And so it would follow that suffering hurts us as human beings in such a profound and shocking way, precisely because human beings really do matter, because we're divine image bearers, and so our lives and well-being are really sacred. And that would mean, if that were true, that pain and suffering would hurt us at more than a physical level. So when we experience some kind of suffering, it's more than the bone being broken or the flesh being bruised. There's something more than just the physical level. And so let's explore that sort of point of view together for a bit. In Genesis, the first book of the Bible, the author talks about human beings being created in the image of God. There's this famous verse in chapter 1, verse 27, saying God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So Christian faith claims that there is a God-likeness about us as human beings, whoever we are, whether we're poor or rich, whatever race we are, or whatever era of history we're born into, our lives are essentially valuable because we bear the divine image. And whether a person believes in God or not, they are, and we are, creatures of dignity. So it's not dependent on us believing that about ourselves. It is true at an essential level. The you that makes you you has a transcendent source. Your value is not imagined or invented. It is real. And its grounding is God's image in you. And so the Bible's response to the question of why God allows suffering builds on this essential claim that every human life bears God's image. The Bible talks about a good God creating a good world, and the first kind of creation account rings with that phrase: God saw that it was good, it was good, it was good, it was good. And God locates people in a specific context where they're given the ability to choose, to make a decision. God makes human beings to have the capacity to love, and that means having the capacity to choose, because for love to exist, freedom must exist. As a teenager, I grew up in Birmingham, Britain's second largest city, and when I was 15, I became friends with a girl whose parents were trying to force her into a marriage with a man from a different country that she didn't know. And she was 15, she was absolutely terrified, and she had really good reason to be afraid, because in the previous year, her cousin had been in the same position, and her cousin had tried to run away from this situation, but had been tracked down by relatives and had been knocked over in the street with a car, put in the back seat of the car, and hadn't been seen again. So my teenage friend was really afraid and was just questioning what her life was going to be. And she knew deep down that she didn't want what was sort of coming down the pipeline for her. And I remember her saying that she wanted to love and to be loved. She wanted to have the ability to love and be loved. And she felt that she needed to have some kind of say in that. She wasn't actually necessarily against arranged marriage per se, but she wanted to be able to exercise a choice of some sort, and she felt that she was capable of giving and receiving love that couldn't and shouldn't be compelled by other people. So friends helped her to get to a safe house and to escape from that situation. But I remember as a teenager realizing through her experience that for love to be possible, it must be freely offered and received. And on some level, we all know this to be the case. The Bible speaks about a God who creates us in his image as human beings, and he creates us with a capacity to love. He creates us with a capacity to love each other and ultimately to love him, and that means the capacity to choose. So the two human beings in this story, Adam and Eve, are given a specific scenario in which they can make a choice that illustrates the reality of the moral choice that human beings have been given. So this story right at the beginning of the Bible tells us that God, who is love, makes a world in which love is possible, and that entails a world in which human beings have choice. And then the idea put forward is that as human beings, we've used our choices to harm as well as to love. And that is why there is injustice and darkness and pain and suffering in this world. Genesis describes the impact of the choices that we make as human beings, not just on ourselves, but also on others, and actually upon the very environment of the earth itself. And then there's this sense of a progression of consequences of multiple moments of selfishness spreading rapidly so that the effects are felt by everyone, including those not directly or personally morally responsible for a particular poor decision. So the way that we have made our choices has impacted others in the very fabric of the universe. And so Christian faith tells us how suffering has come into the world and also why it hurts so much. It hurts this much because we're more than our biochemistry and because we are not here by accident, because life has a transcendent source, because we are bearers of the divine image. In some way, we sense this in ourselves and for others, even those we will never know intimately. And so when we see others suffer, we feel and experience outrage because we instinctively see the preciousness of their lives. On the 14th of June in 2017, a fire broke out in a 24-storey apartment block in West London called Grenfell Tower. I'm sure you'll all remember it, and despite the efforts of the London Fire Brigade, the fire engulfed the upper stories of the building. And it later became clear that the cladding that had been installed on the exterior to sort of update the London skyline look, rather than being fireproof, had actually acted as an accelerant. And 72 people lost their lives in that fire, including children. The local churches in that community were at the forefront of efforts to feed and clothe and comfort displaced residents. And my husband and I were invited in 3 days after the fire to come and help lead a sort of community service, really, to just gather people actually outside in the street and have a kind of expression of grief. And over 1,000 people from the area gathered that Sunday morning under the railway arches and the flyover of the A40. And lots of people were just stunned and, you know, not crying. Others were crying, having lost relatives. And the psalm that the passage of scripture that had been chosen for this event that was read by someone from the community was Psalm 147, and verse 3 says that God heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. And people kind of huddled together in this service, and the reader continued on, and it gets to verse 6 of this psalm, and it says, "The Lord sustains the humble but casts the wicked to the ground." And as the reader was trying to go on to read verse 7, the crowd spontaneously erupted into clapping and shouting. The grief and anger of a community found an outlet in celebrating the words of a Hebrew poet from around 2,500 years ago. The wicked will be cast to the ground. The idea that the perpetrators responsible for what had happened, and no one knew at that point who was to blame. There were all sorts of angers against the government and goodness knows who just rippling through the community. But the idea that there might be accountability for what had happened caused people to applaud, caused people to clap. Where does our anger come from when we see horrendous things happen to those we love, including and those we don't know? If it is true that all human life bears the image of God, then anger in the context of pain is not only to be expected, it is warranted. It points actually towards God, not away from him. And it comes as a surprise to lots of people to discover that the Bible actually gives voice to people in the midst of suffering, giving freedom to express frustration, grief, anger, and disappointment, including actually railing against God. It's the God of the Bible wants us to relate to him as we really are, including telling him we doubt him, we're angry with him, expressing our hurt towards him when we're in pain. Speaking honestly to God in anger and pain is in the Bible. It's an expected part of the Christian experience. That's actually really unique in kind of religious worldviews, at least. Outrage in the face of injustice, death, disease, or violence makes sense to us as human beings because we instinctively sense this is not the way things are meant to be. But is it rational? Does it make sense of our worldview? Does it make sense of karma? Does it make sense of naturalism? Does it make sense of fatalism? I don't think outrage about evil and suffering does make sense in those systems of thought. It actually points towards a loving God who will uphold justice ultimately, existing rather than not existing. If religious people seem like compliant do-gooders to you, out of touch with the real world and telling people who suffer or who doubt or who question God that they're not religious enough, then perhaps some of the words of the Bible might be surprising to us. My God, why have you forsaken me? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. Psalm 22. Or we might look at Job, does it please you, God, to oppress me, to spurn the work of your hands? Or Habakkuk, a prophet in the Old Testament, how long must I call to you for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Our human outreach when we see suffering or experience pain points to the fact that deep down we sense this is not how things are meant to be. And it does have a place in the Christian story, a place that gives voice and explanation to what we feel deep down. Our cries for justice and even for judgment carry with them echoes of Christianity. If we were made for love, if life has a transcendent source, if God's good image marks every human being, and if we've been harmed and marred by this world and each other and our own choices, it's no surprise that we experience pain in the way that we do. But if the world is cold and meaningless and we're nothing more than physical arrangements of atoms, all of that sound and fury and all of our questions mean absolutely nothing. So just as I bring this into land and we open things up for questions, the Christian faith gives us some kind of explanatory framework for why the world is as it is and how and why we experience suffering as we do, but we're not left there with explanation. Christian faith also introduces us to a God who enters this suffering world in history and willingly suffers with us and for us, and offers us, on the basis of Jesus's death and resurrection, an ultimate hope beyond the grave, and God's presence with us in this suffering world, and the promise of his help with us and for us, not denying or shutting down our experiences of pain, but offering us relationship in the midst of it. So thank you for listening to my presentation. There's so much more that could be said, of course, but I'm going to hand back now for time of questions.